introduce him. I'm not seeing him in the...
He's right over here.
Oh. Mr. Labib was born in Cairo, studied business administration at Cairo University, and obtained his MBA from Thunderbird School of Global Management in Arizona. He worked in the IT field in New York City, Cyprus, Pakistan, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman before he moved back to New Jersey to work for AT&T headquarters for 10 years, including an expatriate assignment to AT&T International Headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. Currently, he lives in Zurich and manages a Swiss telecom operator. Adel traveled extensively throughout the Middle East, from Morocco to Iraq and all the way south to Yemen, and has a good understanding of the culture and business practices in the region. He is an Egyptian American and Swiss citizen who can communicate in Arabic, German, French, Spanish, and now learning Portuguese. That's great. And working on his English. He has traveled extensively, conducting business on 6 continents, from Brazil to Japan, as well as some interesting places like Iraq and Yemen before the recent wars. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Adel Labib.
Thank you, Madam, for the introduction.
Most welcome.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to moderate this session with the diverse renowned speakers who are subject matters in their respective fields. We're going to look at forms of persecution. Is persecution limited to exploding a bus or church or slaughtering, innocent cops on the shores of Libya? Or is it the day-to-day aspects of life we will experience growing up in Egypt and other countries with similar culture? For the limited time we have, we will touch up and briefly discuss forms of persecution. Does it happen overnight? Where does it emanate from? What leads to it? Is it the product of what the media calls sectarian strife? Is it 2 groups fighting each other, or one group trying to subjugate and dominate, other minority groups who do not agree to become dhimmis? Does it have religious motivation, or is it based only on ethnicity? We're going to learn from history, and we're going to discuss solutions as well. Talking about history, I would like to share some thoughts I had a couple of years ago when I visited Yerevan, Armenia. I went to the Genocide Museum, and I had very astonishing experience in my head. I didn't expect it when I planned actually to visit there. First, going through everything in that museum, something was going into my head. How did the world let this happen? Did they see it coming? There is enough evidence that makes me wonder how come countries, including the USA, till today do not recognize the genocide. Of course, not one single Muslim majority country recognized that genocide despite all evidence. The sad part was the world saw it coming. There was enough evidence that the world knew about it. There was media excerpts in most of Europe, especially France, in New York. Sadly to say, they let it happen. Second thing that went through my thoughts, the tactics. Everything I saw brought chills to my, to me as I saw same things that happened over 100 years ago happening today. Let's start by saying the Young Turks started that upon the revolution. Made me think about our revolutions in Egypt, whether the one in 52 or the recent one. To go through them quickly, it actually started with the questioning the loyalty of the, let's say, minority groups, vilification, demonization. Then it goes into what the West consider minor stuff, abducting girls and women, soldiers in the army committing suicide or being killed. Of course, they will commit suicide with 3 bullets in the back. And of course, before their suicide, there are bruises all over their body. The list goes on and on by rounding up and persecuting intellectuals, clergy, the media vilification and the popular support. It became almost like a holy war. They were very proud of the atrocities. There were photos of very proud Ottoman or Turkish soldiers with the heads of their victims. It was almost like a horror movie. To wrap up this point, I also question whether this just a process of Turkification at the time, or there was more to it. Of course, I would like to mention that Armenians were not the only victims. There were other groups, the Assyrians, the Jews, and of course there are 5 million Greeks that went unaccounted for since this era. With that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Edward Clancy. He's the Director of Outreach for Eden Church in Need. ACN is an international Catholic charity under the guidance of the Holy See. He's based in New York, and ACN provide assistance to the persecuted church all over the world, and provide funding of around $150 million annually. Edward has been with ACN for more than 17 years. He's been all over the world on search fact-finding missions, especially in the Middle East. He frequently interviewed and has made numerous presentations around the U.S., including Capitol Hill and the United Nations, mainly in support of Christians who are persecuted for their faith. He and his wife live in New York and has 2 daughters. And I would like also to mention that in 2016, Edward became a Knight of Malta. He will begin his discernment for the permanent diaconate later this year. Mr. Clancy.
Thank you. I guess I'm a baseball fan, and one of the things that you know in baseball is you put the fast guy up first because he's got to get on base so the others can bring him home. So I guess my job here is to be quick. I'll try my best. Your Excellencies, honored guests, my distinguished fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here, first of all. President Gerges and everyone in the Coptic Solidarity, thank you for inviting me and for allowing me to speak on behalf of persecuted Christians around the world. Aid to the Church in Need has been on the forefront of support of those persecuted for their faith since the 1940s. First in answer to the forced migration of German nationals, and then to help after the communists took over Eastern Europe and forced the repression of faith. Each year we support projects in over 100 countries. Last year we sent over $20 million to help Christian communities in the Middle East. Our general mission is to support the pastoral work of the church, that is the day-to-day activities such as catechesis, vocation support, building of churches, and transportation. The recent world events have caused us to focus more on the urgent call of Christians who are trying to survive. Another mission for us is to spread the message of those who cannot speak for themselves and help find answers so that millennial-old communities can remain and have a future in the lands of their birth. Persecution flourishes where there is absence of freedom and ignorance. The first line of defense in the modern world is for governments to defend the rights of people to exist, to speak freely, to be represented in government, and to practice their faith freely. In the United States, these freedoms are placed first and foremost in the Bill of Rights of our U.S. Constitution. Unfortunately, this is not the case in most of the globe, especially in the Middle East. Christian persecution and the lack of freedoms for Christians to be and act as Christians is all too prevalent today. The question is, do Christians get protection by constitutions? The constitutions created recently in the Middle East have given a nominal protection to Christians at best, but the prescriptions are often false. There can be wording that pretends freedom of worship, but not freedom of religion. The differentiation allows for religions to be sequestered inside church structures. It can also be used to limit the faithful from truly practicing their faith in their daily lives. Separate of national or federal controls and freedoms are the bureaucracies and administrations that put barriers in Christian communities. Many years ago, our organization helped a dissident bishop to build the first new church allowed in his country by their government. Numerous hurdles and administrative blocks were put in the way, but it was built. It took years to accomplish, but they endeavored. The church is the Arkapana Church in Nowa Huta, Poland. The bishop, Karol Wojtyła, is a man who would later be known as John Paul II. Egypt, Pakistan, Nigeria, to name a few countries, have faced this dual legal system. Often, work needs to be done without local permits, because waiting will endanger the project and will be the sacrifice of the community. Aside from these administrative controls, there's also overt pressures by regimes to limit or destroy Christian worship in Christian communities. In China recently, churches have come under increasing attack. Churches have been destroyed, worshipers have been arrested, and communities have been harassed. This happened after it seemed there was a tolerance, or more tolerance, within China's borders. There is a growth of Christian faithful, and it's seen as the enemy. But the leadership has become emboldened and has a sense of mission. Recently, Cuba saw a change of leadership. Even if this is a token change, with complete power transfer not yet happening, there is genuine fear among the Christians that there will be greater shows of strength and repression to validate and reinstitute stringent controls of churches and their faithful. Nationalism is another means by which Christians are persecuted. Hindu nationalists have attacked the minority Christian communities often. In 2008, there was a pogrom against Christians because a Hindu religious leader was killed by a Maoist militant. One of the militants happened to be a baptized Christian. So the religious leaders decided to parade the body of the person through the countryside. And in each town, they started something. Along the way, houses were burned, people were killed. Priests and nuns were stripped naked and paraded through the streets. They beat the priests and nuns out in the open, and they raped the nun repeatedly. The police were across the street watching it. They did nothing. The Dalits of India, for example. Christianity among the Dalits is on the rise. There's new opportunities for a group of people that are considered outcasts. They no longer see themselves as lesser beings. The sense of human dignity and equality are becoming possibilities. But this change, this sense of hope, places pressures on certain power structures. There has been pushback, and these communities are attacked regularly. Young men and women are victimized. Girls are raped by rape gangs. Boys are stripped naked and beaten. And all they seek to do is go to school in the morning. But the Christian community is on the front lines, sending missionaries to places where they're not allowed to go. Another method of repressing Christianity is the use of violence in societies. Pakistan is a prime example. The anti-blasphemy laws maintain strict penalties for breaking these laws, and they range from canings to imprisonment and execution. Pakistan's government proudly proclaims that they've never executed anyone for violation of these laws, but mobs have. In fact, you don't even have to have a trial. You just have to have the accusation. We all probably are familiar with the case of Aja Bibi. a young Christian woman who had the crime of drinking water from the same water source as other Muslims, She was later accused of insulting the Prophet Muhammad, which, by the way, is the highest and worst offense in Pakistan. She was sentenced to death after a mock trial. She has languished in prison for nearly 8 years. Now, there's been efforts to release her, but there's also great fear, because if she's released, hundreds or thousands of Christians may suffer. They already know that her family cannot remain there. They already know that she cannot remain there. The question is, would she even survive release? Because in Pakistan, mob rules. Another way is limiting education. Christians, while often the most educated populations in countries where they are minorities, can also find very high hurdles to move forward in advanced education. In Pakistan, again, children are required to read passages from the Quran without error in order to advance from one grade to another. Unfortunately, Christians are not permitted to own the Quran. In fact, possession of the Quran outside of school can cause punishment. Certainly, this is not an example of free and open exchange of ideas. In Sudan and South Sudan, we've regularly had petitions from highly educated young professionals seeking opportunities to work abroad. Because while they might have advanced degrees in education or other professional fields, they're not given opportunity to use them. Women who are teachers with multiple degrees are forced to take menial jobs in order to support their families so they won't starve. Poverty, education, and despair also play heavily in creating fertile fields for radicalization. In the Philippines, a rather great majority Christian country, there have been numerous militant actions taken by radical jihadists. Abu Sayyaf, Jamia Islamiyah, and the Maute in Marawi have used control of local economies and destruction of property to subjugate the local populations. The Maute were founded in 2012, right about the same time that the Arab Spring was occurring, and went about creating violent cells of actors to put pressure on local people and officials until they occupied government buildings in 2017, taking hundreds hostage, including a Catholic priest and some of his faithful. The 6-month-long battle killed thousands, and guerrilla warfare tactics made it nearly impossible to rescue the people who were used as pawns in the battle. The end result might have been a military victory for the AFP. But there is great fear that the warriors are now recruiting for ISIS out in the jungles. In fact, they are. We've had numerous reports of this happening. The thousands who fled to neighboring cities have amongst them some militant recruiters. The cities that they moved to, which used to be or are Christian majority, are now seeing the uprising of violent activity. Now small payments in food are used to recruit these young men. Islamic leaders are using the suffering people to advance their cause. The de-Christianization of the Middle East. 2 years ago, there was a declaration of genocide against the Christians and Yazidis by ISIS in the areas of Syria and Iraq. First by EU and then by the US State Department. This is true throughout the Middle East because the minority populations are being pushed out. And this is one of the key principles in convincing that genocide was occurring. 20 years ago, Iraq had something like 1.3 million Christians. Today, there is under 250,000, and many of them may leave too. When I first visited Bethlehem 25 years ago, there was somewhere about 20% Christian population. Bethlehem now has under 2% Christian population, and that's less than a generation. Egypt, we see the marginalization of the Christian population. They're underreported so that they do not get the proper representation that they deserve. And as President Burgess had just mentioned, they are pushed out of the leadership roles in government and institutions. So the question is, what can the West do? What can we here in this room do? Well, last year, Vice President Pence promised that the administration would change procedures so that direct funding by U.S. government could help Christian and other marginalized communities. Unfortunately, bureaucracy reared its ugly head again. The projects that were presented were not approved by USAID recently. Thankfully, the Vice President has remained steadfast in his recently vowed support. While speaking at the Southern Baptist Convention in Dallas last week, he said, "But I want to make a promise to each and every one of you. We will not rest until we give our fellow Christians and persecuted countries across the Middle East the resources and support they need to recover, rebuild, and flourish in their ancient homelands again." The Vice President seems to be living up to his promise. After projects were rejected, on June 8th, he sent a letter stating that he wanted USAID's president to go visit these areas and come back with a report and find projects that need funding. One of the other things that's being done is controlling the narrative. While we were on the bus here and last night while we were speaking, my fellow panelists was saying things like, words like Islamophobia is used anytime you criticize anyone who is in leadership. But it's not a real word, Islamophobia. It's not fear. As Dr. rightly said, fear of a tiger killing you is not a phobia. It's fact. So the question is, will we remain silent? Will we not unite and do something to help our communities around the world, wherever they might be, to speak up, to do something, and to act? I hope we do. I know we will. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clancy. I would like now to introduce Reverend Father Philemon Patitsas. Father Patitsas is the presiding pastor of St. Catherine Greek Orthodox Church in Naples, Florida. He was installed by Metropolitan Alexius in July 2012 after completing graduate degree with the highest distinction at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, it's Master of Divinity, and the Harvard Kennedy School as a Master of Public Administration. He entered the Holy Priesthood after a distinguished 20-year career as an MBA, as a petroleum engineer, and business executive with Fortune 550 chemical and petroleum companies. Since becoming the priest of St. Catherine, Father Philemon has helped to energize and establish numerous worship, discipleship, and service ministries, including Christian Rights and Freedom Institute. The Christian Rights and Freedom Institute, founded 2014 in response to the invasion of Mosul, Iraq, as a means of opposing and stopping the ensuing genocide. He is a Christian private donor supported educational and advocacy organization, bearing witness to God's love on the current moral and ethical challenges of our day, especially in the religious liberty, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights on persecution and genocide.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I would like to start by sharing a prophetic utterance from a very great modern saint. And this is what he said: "They are silent out of indifference. In these difficult days, each must do what's in their power and leave what's out of their power to the will of God. In this way, our conscience will be clear. If we don't resist, then our ancestors will arise from their graves. They suffered so much for the fatherland, and we, what are we doing for it? If Christians don't begin to witness their faith, to resist evil, then the destroyer will become even more insolent. But today's Christians are no warriors. If the church keeps silent to avoid conflict with the government, if the metropolitans are silent, if the monks hold their peace, then who will speak up?" These are the words of St. Paisios of the Holy Mountain, Mount Athos, who was canonized in the early 1990s. Good morning. Christ is in our midst. He is and ever shall be. We are together co-suffering people of the cross, followers of Jesus Christ, and people of the book, as the Muslims call us. Yet most of the time we do not stand in unity with one another, although they group us together. So we are most of the time the source as Christians of our own vulnerability. The Muslims also call us Nazarenes because we follow Jesus of Nazareth, which we do. And they cannot bear to use the word Christ or to call us Christians, because by so doing, they would be acknowledging that we believe the Messiah, the anointed one of God, has come to save us from our sins, which is the meaning of the name Jesus, God saves his people. Muslims, by calling us Christians, would be unwittingly proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ, and by explaining the name of Jesus, they would be doing the same. I bear witness to you that I am a Christian by wearing a cross around my neck that contains a piece of the true cross of Jesus Christ embedded in it, which I received as a gift from the Holy Patriarchate of Jerusalem. I also wear a pin that our community offers. I'll just stand so you can see it. A pin that our community offers in sale to raise money for the persecuted Christians. It displays the Arabic letter N because we joyfully confess that we do in fact follow Jesus of Nazareth. Although they like to put this symbol on the homes of the Christians that are marked for genocide. Although it breaks my heart to descend into the hell with you of the suffering Egyptian Christians, and it is a shame, in fact, that we are even here today for this purpose. We should be here instead to worship. But we must discuss this painful topic, forms of persecution. I am here to learn about your experience, as I have already, and already made new friendships, and your experience as Coptic Christians of daily suffering for your Christian faith. And I'm here to say, as a Greek Orthodox Christian, we love you. We see that you are martyrically suffering. We believe that enough is enough, and we want to help you. I am here in Washington, D.C. with you as our brother and sister Coptic Christians for the next several days as a Greek Orthodox clergyman with the blessing of His Eminence Metropolitan Alexios of Atlanta, a holy hierarch of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. I am the presiding priest of the St. Catherine Greek Orthodox Church in Naples, Florida, and I invite you all to visit us. And I wish to express to you the love and respect of our community, which is a parish family. Our patron saint is St. Catherine of Alexandria, Egypt, whose relics reside at the St. Catherine Monastery, which, as we know, is located at the base of Mount Sinai, which monastery is the protector even of the Edict of Mohammed. Are we aware of this edict? Which proclamation eternally granted protection and religious freedom to Christians everywhere. Although it is sealed with his handprint, sadly it is overwhelmingly ignored or unknown about by the Muslim community. I am the spiritual advisor, as you so kindly mentioned, to the Christian Rights and Freedom Institute, a group which our parish founded in response to ISIS's invasion of the city of Mosul, Iraq in 2014. Our calling, plain and simple, is to witness to our faith by peacefully uplifting Christ. CRFI offers an annual speaker series that challenges our audiences to connect, educate, and advocate for solutions to Christian genocide, in support of universal human rights and religious liberty, and to speak on the current moral and ethical issues of our day. Our programs have reached tens of thousands of people, either in person or over the internet, and we have now expanded to using live stream technology over the internet, as I believe we're doing today, even perhaps at this moment. We are now making plans for our 5th season, which we invite you to join us in Naples, which we hope will feature great American Christian voices such as Robert Spencer, the founder of Jihad Watch, Hank Hanegraaff, the Bible Answer Man, Tim Tassopoulos, the president and COO of Chick-fil-A, Jordan Sekulow, the executive director of the American Center for Law and Justice, and hopefully even Reince Priebus will join us, whose name needs no further explanation. 4 of them are Greek Orthodox Christians, and the 5th of these men of God is seriously considering becoming one, and we are grateful. We also fully support the work of a group you may or may not know about called the Archons, the Order of St. Andrew the Apostle, numbering more than 850 people of distinction from throughout the world, predominantly in the U.S. and Europe. These individuals have committed themselves to protecting the ecumenical patriarch, His All Holiness Bartholomew of Constantinople. Although His All Holiness is considered to be second in rank among equals only to the Pope of Rome, when counted among the ancient sees of Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, he is treated as a second-class citizen in his own country of Turkey, even though he has full Turkish citizenship. His travel and his appearances are restricted. His flock has been diminished to less than 3,000 people through oppressive policies that prevent the building of new churches, the repair of existing ones. Thousands of church properties have been seized, monasteries and churches have been closed, and the Halki Theological School, that has the proud history of educating all past and current patriarchs, has been closed and remains shuttered since the 1970s. As a panelist of this morning's session on forms of persecution, as an attendee of this august gathering, the 9th Annual Conference of Coptic Solidarity, I've been asked to bear witness about the Greek Orthodox experience of suffering for more than 600 years directly under the Ottoman Empire, and we may say of 14 centuries since the emergence of Islam in the 7th century to the present day. It is impossible to summarize this experience in this short address and the time that I have been allotted, but there is one word, an Arabic word, that summarizes the Islamic policy that applies to all of these centuries, and that is dawah. Am I saying it correctly? Thank you. As I understand it, it means a call or an invitation to join Islam, which in reality is not an invitation at all, because the word invitation implies that a free will choice will be made. Yes? In reality, it's an entire system of genocidal oppression that is designed to achieve the purpose and the meaning of Islam, which means submission by any means necessary until Islam rules the world. And everyone has submitted to it, including everyone here. The conquering of the great and holy city of Constantinople, the modern city of Istanbul, Turkey, is arguably one of the most tragic and pivotal moments in all of human history, because the center of religion, of trade, of faith, of theology between Europe, Asia, and Africa fell into the hands of an oppressive and restrictive political system that was antichrist in its orientation. The experience vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire that followed imposed dawah in various phases to varying degrees and by various means throughout its 600-year history until all the Orthodox Christians were subjugated. Unique paths and histories apply to the Orthodox Christians of Greece and Asia Minor, to the islands of Cyprus, to Crete, and to the Balkans. Forms of persecution. Perhaps it's best, rather than attempting to reinvent it, to simply look to the definition that has been offered by Genocide Watch. And let me skip down on the page so I can find that quickly. And here's how they define the forms of persecution. Really, the stages of genocide. The first one is classification. All cultures have categories to distinguish people into us and them, by ethnicity, by race, by religion, or nationality. They're German and Jew, Hutu and Tutsi, and we could say much more. Symbolization is the second stage of genocide. We give names or other symbols to the classification. We name people Jews or Gypsies or distinguish them by colors or dress and apply the symbols to members of groups. Classification and symbolization are universally human, do not necessarily result in genocide unless they lead to dehumanization. The third stage is discrimination. A dominant group uses a law, a custom, and political power to deny the rights of other groups. The powerless group may not be accorded full civil rights, as we have heard about, or even citizenship. Examples include the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 in Nazi Germany, which stripped Jews of their German citizenship and prohibited their employment by the government and by universities. Does it sound familiar? 4, dehumanization. One group denies the humanity of the other group. Members of it are equated with animals, vermin, insects, or diseases. Dehumanization overcomes the normal human revulsion against murder. At this stage, hate propaganda in print and on hate radios is used to vilify the victim group in combating this dehumanization. Incitement to genocide should not be confused with protected speech. Stage 5, organization. Genocide is always organized, usually by the state, often using militias to provide deniability of state responsibility. We can speak of the Janjaweed in Darfur, for example. Sometimes organization is informal, Hindu mobs led by local RSS militants or decentralized terrorist groups. The 6th stage is polarization. Extremists drive the groups apart. Hate groups broadcast polarizing propaganda. Laws may forbid intermarriage or social interaction. Extremist terrorism targets moderates, intimidating and silencing the center. Moderates from the perpetrator's own group are most able to stop genocide, so they are the first to be arrested and killed. The 7th stage is preparation. National or perpetrator group leaders plan the final solution, as they did in Turkey, of the Greeks, through the pogrom of 1955 in Constantinople. To the Jewish, the Armenian, Tutsi, or other targeted groups, they are questioned. They often use euphemisms to cloak their intentions, such as referring to their goals as ethnic cleansing, purification, or counterterrorism. They build armies, buy weapons, and train their troops and militias. The 8th stage is persecution. Victims are identified and separated out because of their ethnic or religious identity. Death lists are drawn up. In state-sponsored genocide, members of victim groups may be forced to wear identifying symbols or special clothing. In stage 9 is the active extermination phase. Begins and quickly becomes the mass killing legally called genocide. It is extermination to the killers because they do not believe their victims to be fully human. In stage 10 is denial. It's the final stage that lasts throughout and always follows a genocide. It is among the surest indicators of further genocidal massacres. If you never confess, you will repeat your sin. Turkey is still denying the genocide, and it seems they always will, at least under its current leaders. We can go from here. Is it 5 minutes? Maybe I can get done in 5 minutes. Greece only achieved its independence from the Ottoman rule in 1821. Following World War I, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed, which at the time identified the modern boundaries of Greece that exist to this day. The genocide of the Greeks, which lasted from 1914 to 1923, although we've really not done a good job as Greek Americans as talking about it, resulted in a reduction in population in Asia Minor of more than 5 million people. We are talking about the Armenian genocide, and it was less, but we don't talk about the Greek genocide. The city of Smyrna was burned in 1920, and the Greek populace was murdered, and a few escaped with their lives. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk established the modern state of Turkey in 1923 by means of his policy of genocide of the Greek Armenians, Assyrians, Kurds, and Jews of Asia Minor, and he served as its first president until his death in 1938. So the Turkification of Asia Minor, which was his policy, is actually a euphemism for genocide, as very few Turks were added to the populace through its exchange with Greece, as most of the movement was of the Greek population who were expelled from Asia Minor to the west. It was the failure of the world to confront the Armenian genocide in particular that emboldened Adolf Hitler to organize his Holocaust of the Jews. After all, who remembers the Armenians? The 1955 pogrom of Constantinople is considered to be the Greek Kristallnacht. It was the day in which a mob of 100,000 young Turks, that's a very complex term that requires study to understand, within the space of an hour, they all attacked every Greek business, destroyed churches, desecrated cemeteries, and their aim was to break the economic backbone of the Greek community and foster fear and to humiliate. The modern state of Turkey, if we can really call it modern, has been ruling dictatorially under the President Recep Erdogan, and it's openly expressing his ambitions to reestablish the Ottoman rule. He is making continual threats to seize the islands of the Aegean Sea, which are overwhelmingly Greek. He sends daily flyover of Turkish fighter jets over the Aegean, and he is threatening even to overrun Greece. Turkey has already seized, you probably know, the northern 40% of the island of Cyprus. Now I want to just close by mentioning a few resources you may find helpful. And I will refer you to the Christian Rights and Freedom Institute website. And you'll see in the menu, you can click under further reading, a number of beautiful monograms that will provide further detail on Dawah, the Islamic strategy for reshaping the modern world, Resurgent Islam and the Response of the Church is the second monogram, and the third being a brief history of the Ottoman Greek genocide, together with a description of the great pogrom of Istanbul of 1955. I also want to mention the books written by William Kilpatrick that I highly recommend: Christianity, Islam, and Atheism, The Struggle for the Soul of the West. He offers some thoughts on what to do about it. And the book, The Rise and Fall of the Ottoman Empire, the history of the Turkish Empire's creation and its destruction over 600 years, that was prepared by Charles River editors. The History of Greece under Ottoman and Venetian Domination by George Finley. And of course, we must also recommend the reading of the Bible. And particularly, I like the Orthodox Study Bible published by Thomas Nelson Publishers. In closing, may I say lovingly, may the All-Holy Trinity, who reveals himself in both the Old and New Testaments as three hypostases, persons of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in one Godhead, or On, as we say in Greek, the one who is, or Yahweh in Hebrew, and through the only begotten Son of the Father, our Lord Jesus Christ, who through his incarnation reveals himself as fully God and fully man, with two natures, both human and divine, and two wills, both human and divine. This faith that we share makes us one body. As we jointly confess, we all confess the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. Let us, by God's grace and mercy, love one another more and more, so that one day also that we will confess one faith, one Lord, one baptism, as it says in Ephesians 4:5, to the point that we may share in the one cup, which is the risen Lord Jesus Christ, described in 1 Corinthians 10:16. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to meeting you by God's grace and mercy as the conference unfolds. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Reverend Patitsas. Now I would like to introduce Professor Henry Srebrnik. He teaches comparative politics in the Department of Political Science at the University of Prince Edward Island. In his research, Dr. Srebrnik examines the impact of nationalism and ethnicity-based political conflict on societies. He has co-edited the Vanished Ideology essays on the Jewish communist movement in the English-speaking world in the 20th century. Published in 2016, it's the first book to examine comprehensively the rise and decline of the Jewish communist movement in the English-speaking world. Along with many scholarly articles, Professor Srebrnik has written 3 other books on the subject of Jewish communities and communities. Dr. Srebrnik.
Okay. Father Philemon has given us the 10 stages of genocide, and I might add to my bio that I was born, so to speak, an expert on genocide, unfortunately, because my parents were both in a Nazi concentration camp in Poland during the World War, in their hometown of Częstochowa, which is, of course, a very famous Catholic city because of the Black Madonna. This is obviously a long story, and I never knew of it until my mother provided testimony at one of the Holocaust museums. I was actually conceived in a Nazi concentration camp, and she was 3 months pregnant when the Russians liberated the camp. And so her pregnancy was not yet noted. Obviously, she wasn't eating much and all the rest of it. A month later, probably, she would have been shocked and I wouldn't be talking to you. So I'm actually speaking about the Hitler genocide. And as you know, the theme of the conference relates to faces of persecution, and my topic is on the delegitimization of German Jews. In other words, the first few numbers on that process leading to genocide. And of course, I end basically in 1939 with the beginning of the World War. So I consider this a cautionary tale, that of a parallel hatred to what is now going on in the Middle East vis-a-vis Christians in 20th century Europe. When Hitler came into, scholars have long debated when the decision to carry out the so-called final solution to the Jewish question, another euphemism, was actually made. Most now believe that the Holocaust was an escalating series of actions driven by pressure from both above and below. No single order was really necessary. And of course, Holocaust deniers always point to this, that there's no piece of paper with Adolf Hitler's signature saying kill 6 million Jews. However, in a speech to the Reichstag on January 30th, 1939, half a year before the war began, Hitler prophesied that, quote, if the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will be not the Bolshevization of the earth, because for Hitler, Bolshevism and Jewry were synonymous, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. So this was clearly an oblique command. Ian Kershaw, a very well-known scholar on German Nazism, has tried to make sense of how all this came about. And in a number of books, he's expounded on the concept of, quote, working toward the Führer. When explicit directions from Hitler was lacking, Nazi functionaries guessed at what he wanted and often further radicalized his policies. They took the initiative in murdering Jews in their respective regions, and their actions met with approval from superiors. But how did it all start? How did a supposedly quote-unquote civilized society come to embrace Adolf Hitler's extreme ideas? It clearly depended on a unique conjuncture of catastrophic events. And we all know the various things that happened between 1914 and 1933, all kinds of extraordinary crises. A world war that the Germans lost when they thought they should have won it, a monarchy destroyed, bringing in a republic, hyperinflation in the 1920s, which wiped out everybody's savings, and so forth and so on. And finally, of course, the Great Depression, which really hit Germany very, very hard. The story of Hitler's public life, and it is an incredible thing how this happened, coming out of nowhere. It starts in 1919. He emerges in Munich as a far-right agitator. This is a country that is completely engulfed by chaos and so forth. And by 1921, had gained control of what was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Of course, the NAZI is the NAZI. I'm Canadian. The NAZI is the shorthand for that. He tried at first, of course, to gain power by a coup, the famous Beer Hall Putsch. This didn't work. They sent him to jail, where he managed to write Mein Kampf. So perhaps jailing him was a mistake. And then he determined to gain power in Germany through legal means. The Nazi seizure of power was carried out step by step through the first half of 1933, and each step was disguised as a seemingly legal act. The Reichstag passed the Enabling Act on March 23, 1933. He had become chancellor on January 30th, following the burning down of the National Parliament, which of course we now know the Nazis themselves did, but they blamed it on communists and others. This suspended the Constitution, gave Hitler the power to enact laws without the involvement of the Parliament. He governed by executive decree. Freedom of the press, speech, and assembly were suspended. Due process and the autonomy of state governments were soon gone, and so forth and so on. By the summer of 1933, and just after half a year, the Nazis had shut down the country's democratic institutions, destroyed the freedom of the press and media, and created a one-party state. When Hitler became chancellor, German Jews made up less than 1% of the population in Germany, approximately 500,000 out of 67 million people. Of course, in the Weimar Republic, prior to Hitler, they had full civil, economic, and political rights. Many were fully assimilated into German culture, including, in many cases, conversion to Christianity. None of this, of course, would count for Hitler. All of this would change over the next 6 years as the Nazis regarded Jews as part of a vast, powerful, and deadly threat. So what, in Hitler's worldview, lay behind the incredible animus towards the Jews? It was at the center of his ideology, but part of a wider Weltanschauung, as they say in German, a wider worldview. His racial anti-Semitism was more than a mere dislike of Jews. It was a metaphysical condition that shaped the very way the world was perceived. For Hitler, world Jewry, quote unquote, was the enemy of all that is natural. Human races, and of course we're putting races in quotation marks, human races, Hitler was convinced, were like species. He was really a social Darwinist. The highest ones were still evolving from the lower, which meant that interbreeding, as he called it, was possible but sinful. This for Hitler was a law, the law of racial struggle, as certain as the law of gravity. The struggle could never end. A race could triumph and flourish, or could be starved and extinguished. His belief in natural selection, and it really was a form of eugenics, and the continuous human struggle for existence, led Hitler to conclude that nature's plan was for the stronger to triumph over the weaker. Therefore, right was determined by whatever the powerful imposed on the impotent. It is not only the rejection of a Jew's thought, but the very negation of what Christianity is also. Hitler viewed the world as poisoned by the, quote, Jewish idea of human equality, which was carried over into Christianity and democracy. Through these political and religious systems, the pollution had also penetrated into other domains, such as the arts, science, and medicine. Hitler believed the only way for the world to revert to its natural order was to eradicate the Jews. Though Hitler saw the species, the human species, as divided into races, he denied that the Jews were one. Jews were not a lower or a higher race, but a counter race. Races followed nature and fought for land and food, whereas Jews followed the alien logic of unnature. They insisted on dominating the entire planet, and for this purpose invented general ideas that drew the races away from the natural struggle. Indeed, for Hitler, universalism or a millennial end to history with the elimination of suffering was itself the enemy. This was a lie brought into the world by the Jews, by Judaism, of course, from Moses on. So as the historian Timothy Snyder contends, at Yale, Hitler was a zoological anarchist who believed there was a true state of nature to be restored, the way it was, of course, before modern religions emerged. This was why every Jewish child, woman, and man had to be killed. This was only thinkable because the Jews were the makers and enforcers of a corrupt planetary order. And so for him, of course, there's a worldwide conspiracy. So Nazism posited a Manichaean worldview of history in which the Jews were the forces of darkness and the ultimate metaphysical evil, and so had to be, of course, vanquished. And how is this brought into practice? Very soon it begins. On April 7th, 1933, the new Nazi government issued a civil service law that included an Aryan clause. Now Hitler, of course, appropriated the word Aryan, which really has to do with languages, as the counterpart to Jews. Aryans were Germans and other non-Jews, the higher races, right? And this called for the removal of Jewish civil servants. 4 days later, Jewish attorneys were excluded from the bar. On April 25th, 1933, the law against the overcrowding of German schools was passed, which limited enrollment of Jewish students to 1.5% of new applicants. In September 1933, Jews were forbidden to own farms and to engage in agriculture. They were barred from belonging to journalism associations or from positions of newspaper editors. Economic boycotts of Jewish businesses also began. The Nuremberg race laws, which were just mentioned before, were introduced in 1935 and consisted of two laws. And to us, this sounds incredible. Number one, the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, which forbade extramarital intercourse and marriages between Jews and Germans, or the employment of German girls or women under 45 in Jewish households. And the Reich citizenship law, which declared that only those of German or related blood were eligible to be Reich citizens. All other persons were classified as state subjects. This included some other peoples besides Jews, for example, like the Roma, Gypsies, and a few other categories. So the Nazis rejected the traditional view of Jews as members of a religious or cultural community. They claimed instead that Jews were a race defined by birth and by blood. Only people with 4 German grandparents were considered German. A Jew was someone who descended from 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, regardless of whether that person identified as a Jew or belonged to the Jewish religious community. And this also included, by the way, people who had become Christians. Grandparents born into a Jewish religious community were considered racially Jewish, and their racial status passed on to their children and grandchildren. So Nazi legislators looked, therefore, to family genealogy to define race. In Nazi Germany, no profession of belief and no act or statement could convert a Jew into a German. You were absolutely what you were born. And so this, of course, covered people who did not think of themselves as Jews or had neither religious nor cultural ties to the Jewish community. Some people, in fact, discovered that they were Jews thanks to these laws. So, of course, it defined people who had converted to Christianity from Judaism as Jews. It also defined as Jews people born to parents or grandparents who had converted to Christianity because the blood kept going from generation to generation. There were also incredible details in this madness, what happens to people who are half Jewish, quarter Jewish, etc., etc. To go into all this is just incredible because it sounds like some kind of horror movie. They had a name for them, Mischlinge, and they had to determine whether these people were sufficiently non-Jewish to be allowed into the German race and all the rest of it. You can't even go into this kind of thing. Anyhow, the laws laid the groundwork for Germany's racial policy for the next 10 years. By the end of 1935, all Jewish professors, teachers, physicians, lawyers, and notaries who were state employees were fired. Now, in November of 1939, all this had been done, quote-unquote, legally. All this had been done by the state organs. But people have mentioned Kristallnacht and various other instances. This was really, in a sense, the only, let us call it, traditional pogrom that happens in Nazi Germany. On November 9th of 1938, a Jewish youth murdered a German diplomat in Paris. Hitler, word of this reached Hitler shortly thereafter while he was attending a dinner commemorating his 1923 beer hall putsch. Upon hearing the news, Hitler called for a pogrom directed against Jews. In 2 days of violence, more than 1,000 synagogues were set on fire or destroyed. In 24 hours, at least 91 Jews were killed. Over 30,000 Jewish men aged 16 to 60 were sent to concentration camps. Rampant looting and extreme violence marked Kristallnacht in more than 1,000 cities, towns, and villages throughout Germany and Austria, which had already been annexed to the German Reich. In the aftermath of Kristallnacht, the first decree on the exclusion of Jews from German economic life was enacted. It banned Jews from all remaining occupations and called for dismissing those still employed without any compensation. By 1939, the 185,000 Jews who still remained in Germany, because many, of course, did manage to escape. It was different than when the World War was on. You could still leave if you could get out. So 40% of the pre-war Jewish population was there. They had been completely marginalized, isolated, deprived of their means of earning a living. And there were more than 525 further anti-Semitic decrees. Once the war broke out, of course, the situation of German Jews became virtually hopeless. Only a few hundred survived. From the autumn of 1941 onward, German Jews were deported to quote-unquote bureaucracy-free zones in Eastern Europe. We now know, of course, that these were extermination camps like Auschwitz and Srebrenik and so forth. So the war against the Jews was of greater importance to Hitler than the war against the Allies. Even when it was being lost, Hitler refused to allow redeployment of the trains rolling to the death camps, though they were needed actually for the war effort. And when the trains finally did stop running, because the Russians were about to overrun the mainly Polish-based camps, the SS troops were not redeployed to stave off the Russians. Instead, they were ordered to take their captives on the road in what became the final phase, actually, of the final solution, the so-called death marches, where Jews were actually just marched further westward, beyond the Russian advances. More than 250,000 concentration camp prisoners actually died in this way before the end of the war. The so-called final solution to the Jewish question was pure ideology put into murderous practice. Destroying the Jews, every man, woman, and child, and 1.5 million of those people were children, of course, of the 6 million. This was a metaphysical imperative. All Jews, anywhere and everywhere, would have to be eliminated so that the world could survive, thought Hitler. For the Nazis, this was an absolute existential necessity. And I think this is a warning to everything else that is going on in the world right now. Thank you.